What are some weird or interesting facts about your families? My dad's last name is Black. My mom's last name is LeBlanc, French for the white, and they live in Grey County. My mom is born on September 24th. My dad is born on March 24th. I'm born on May 24th. My parents met on December 24th. And my sister is born on June 2nd, but who cares? I had an ancestor who lied about his age to join up with the Union Army in the American Civil War in 1861. He fought in most of its bloodiest battles, Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg to name a few. He survived all of those to come home to the family farm at the end of the war, where he promptly died of a fever he had picked up in camp. We recently found out that I have at least 5 half-siblings because my parents decided it would be nice and financially beneficial for my dad to make some donations around the time I was born. My great-aunt Rose was able to escape a concentration camp due to a member of royalty in I cannot remember which exact country. After a few months in the camp, she became deathly ill and was left to die in an infirmary. This royalty was visiting the camp and saw her, asked her name and her occupation. Rose was an incredibly talented seamstress, and this person needed a tailor at their estate, so they drew up some papers declaring her a Christian, convinced the Nazis that they had made a mistake, took her into their estate, nursed her back to health, and she spent the rest of the war making and fixing clothes for their family. My granddad was poisoning my nan's tea with rat poison for ages. She was documenting it and told the police. They did a huge bust on him and arrested him in front of all their kids, incorporated my mum, in court. He admitted to it. He agreed to all the charges. He did the deed. Eventually the judge, flummoxed, asked, "But why?" And his answer was, "Because we agreed to it." Apparently, they had made an agreement to use rat poison to home treat her deep vein thrombosis. This brand was basically a blood thinner, so the rats couldn't clot when they got injured. And they both distrust doctors. This woman is crazy, and I fully believe my granddad's side. Case got thrown out of court. My great-grandfather had 21 children. My grandmother dated Bill Clinton in high school. He had a pretty major crush on her. She broke up with him because he was in the band. I placed my newborn for adoption, open adoption. Chose the family myself. A few years later my sister got pregnant and placed her newborn with the same family, so the children are growing up as siblings and are cousins by blood. This was over 20 years ago. Jack in the Box used to have a clown for the voice of Arx in the drive-thru until my grandmother got wasted one night and shot it up after they wouldn't take her order as she walked through. My great-grandfather saved my life, even though he died 89 years before I was born. He was a semi-well-known medical researcher, enough for a Wikipedia page and a family of bacteria to be named after him, who ended up dying after being crazy enough to inject himself with one of the diseases he was studying. 100 years down the line, I caught one of the diseases that he studied. His research had paved the cure of that and a few other serious diseases. My grandfather was the first black aerospace engineer in the United States. My family claim that one of my great-great-uncles was the first man in Ireland to get run over by a van. He worked the docks in Cork and supposedly got hit by a freshly delivered one. Probably just a family anecdote, but I enjoy the image of a dude pointing at a van and saying, "What in holy hell is that th?" My grandpa had been visited by Bill Clinton in our small Arkansas town and asked him for campaign donations. Backstory: my grandpa lived in Detroit and ran an illegal casino in a house. He did something for the people who had ownership on it and left town to my small town in Arkansas. The day he died my dad received 2 letters, one from Governor Bill Clinton, another from a senator at the time. At his funeral a man talked to my dad and expressed sympathy for his loss. Said they were good friends in Detroit. Dad never met him ever. He would, every year, visit the grave and add flowers and clean it up. The frig was my grandpa into? I was born in California, but had to move to Vegas when I was 9. My mom told me the reason why is because my dad cheated on my mom with a gang leader's girlfriend and put a hit on him. The real reason is much squickier. My dad was constantly cheating on my mom, but with his first cousin. Their other cousin found out and wanted to get some with her, but she declined. Outraged, that cousin told my dad he was going to kill him. He was not joking. My mom rented a U-Haul and packed everything she could in there and told my dad if he wanted to stay with that bitch, by all means, but she's not getting my brother or me involved. He had 2 days to make his decision, to stay with my family or leave. He stayed. I kinda wish he didn't, since my dad is a huge disappointment. My great-grandmother's maiden name was Messerschmitt. Rumor has it that a relative designed the Messerschmitt planes in Germany during the First World War. There's no way to prove it though. And on the other side of the family, my great-great-grandfather's name was James Potter. My family lives on what we call a compound. Essentially they own continuous plots of land. My dad, grandparents, uncle, and cousin all have houses next to each other on the compound. Great for visiting, and we had our wedding there, on a river. Dad keeps trying to get my husband and I to join them. Nope. So here's the story of how my great-grandmother escaped Nazi Germany and saved a Torah older than Germany itself. My great-grandmother, Uma, met my great-grandfather in Tel Aviv while she was visiting her cousin. My great-grandfather, Upa, had just recently emigrated from Germany and was in the process of building his house. Upa first saw Uma at the market and approached her by asking for her opinion on which tiles he should buy for his kitchen. As one does, he said he wanted to get a woman's perspective. The rest, as they say, is history. Uma wanted to stay and help Upa finish building their house and life together, but the mandatory government in Palestine had been cracking down on immigration, and particularly the marriage-based kind because of fraud. So to prove that their love was real, Uma had to go back home to Germany for a certain period of time, IDK exactly, and maintain regular correspondence with Upa. Eventually he had to invite her to come back so they could get married. While she was writing letters from her small village in Germany, Nazi crap escalated quickly. So when Uma was preparing to leave, sometime in spring 1938, her uncle came to speak to her. He worked for the village rabbi and could see the writing on the wall. So he begged her to take one of their Torahs with her to Israel by smuggling it in the trunk where she packed her wedding dress and all of the linens for her dowry. She was already a bride-to-be, so it wasn't much of a stretch for her to become very protective and very secretive about her wedding dress while going through German customs. Just a few months later, and that Torah would have been destroyed in Kristallnacht. The Torah she brought to Israel dates back to the 1500s. Each of the wooden handles on the scrolls has a ribbon of text commemorating all the people who donated to the synagogue, so it could be written. It became first Torah to join the congregation in their new moshav. Roughly 20 years later, it sailed across the Atlantic with my Upa, and Grandma. A few years later my grandma got married and moved with my grandpa to West Virginia. The Torah has lived in my grandma's local synagogue ever since. It is no longer considered a kosher Torah today because many letters have faded with time, and it's likely too old to be restored without any risk of harming the scroll. So while it's retired from daily use, it continues to steal the show at family bar mitzvahs, and every year at Simchat Torah, the holiday, where we read the final portion of the Torah covering Moses' death. Start at the beginning with the story of creation, and bring out all the Torah scrolls in the synagogue for a night of singing and dancing. My great-granddad, Salvatore, worked with his father in the coal mines of Appalachia until a mine collapse trapped him and a bunch of other men in the mines. He thought he was going to die, so he prayed to God and said, "Hey, if you get me out of here, I'll never go into the mines again." Lo and behold, he gets out. Gigi Grandad says, "Okay, glad you're safe. We are going back in the mine tomorrow." Salvatore is like, "Hell no." They get into a fight that ends with Salvatore leaving. He makes his way to New Jersey where he finds himself working in a bordello as a translator between the Italian mafia owners and their patrons. Well, the mob boss's daughter catches feelings for Salvatore and the family starts pressuring him to marry the girl. Sal takes one look at the situation and thinks, this can only lead to bad things, and sneaks out of the window in the middle of the night. He makes his way down to Atlanta, and WWI is in full swing at this point, and fearing the mafia might try and find him, he signs up with the Navy to try and get away from America for a while. They take him in, train him up as a bugle boy and assign him to a ship. A few months later, everything is going good. The ship captain has confirmed that they are ready to set sail, and then he finds out that his bugle boy, Salvatore, isn't actually of age or a US citizen. Whoops. Well, the captain can't go back and say that he isn't ready to sail, because he would get into a ton of trouble. So he takes Salvatore down to the courthouse and explains the situation to the judge. The judge says, "No prob. I know what to do." So the captain gets him a bottle of Jack. They slip the number 17 into Salvatore's shoe, and when the judge asks Sal, "Are you over 17?" Sal says, "Yes," and they make him a citizen. Everything is in order. Sal goes and fights in the war, lives, comes back, does a bunch of other really cool crap, and dies at a ripe old age. It recently came to light that my mom's sister is actually her mother, making my aunt actually my grandmother. For at least 3 generations, the women of my family have had very similar and eerie childhood experiences. It's too weird and coincidental for it to not be connected, but I don't think I'll ever get any answers on this earth. My first memory is of me playing in the closet with wire hangers. I was wondering what would happen if I stuck it in my eye, so I did it, and I remember that my eye was bleeding and that I got it in the carpet. I remember seeing myself in the mirror before I passed out and thinking that it was over, but then I remember a man, can't remember any details of his face or anything at all, talked to me, can't remember what he said, touched my face, and then I woke up and it was like it had never happened. My father thought it was my imagination, but my mom always believed that something had really happened, because it had happened to her. When my mom was very young, she was cleaning a bookshelf when she found a shard of glass and I guess got curious and cut her eye open. She remembers that some guy, who she also can't remember, talked to her and healed her, and that her eye was fine. Then she told me that when her mom was little she cut her eye open, I don't know how, and she remembers some guy talking to her and healing her. It's weird and has no real explanation, but it's happened to at least me, my mother, and my grandma. I wouldn't be surprised if it went back even farther than that. I have a big ass family. My dad is one of 13. His mom is one of 16. His dad was one of 18. I have 48 cousins. My dad has over 60 cousins. I have over 200 second cousins. My great grandparents both worked for Thomas Edison, which is how they met. That great grandmother is super badass. 2. She came to the States when she was 15 and didn't speak English. Just as the German Depression was getting bad, she had to teach herself English and raise enough money to bring her starving family over from Germany to join her here. She lost all her savings in the US stock market crash and had to start all over, but she did it. We only die in March. Dogs, grandparents, uncles, we all die in March. My grandpa created the symbol for disabled parking spaces. He was also a Holocaust survivor from Poland and was deaf since birth. He was a super interesting guy and always had a story to tell. He passed away in February. My parents were married within 6 weeks of meeting each other, and they were both engaged to other people at the time. Bonus, my mom was a celebrity, and so was her fiancé. She retired from show business fairly young. He was front page news the day he died. My great grandmother worked as an organist for silent movies. My father-in-law had polio as a child. He was in the placebo group of Salk's drug trial. My brother is the 3rd generation single-handedly running the family farm. Maybe not so interesting, but city folk like me always are amazed when they find out there are farmers in my family. My grandfather accidentally killed a man. My papa and his buddies were enlisted, but had a night off. They were out having a couple of drinks at a bar when he was flirting with a woman. A fellow didn't like that and confronted my grandpa, but he wasn't having any of it since he didn't want to get in trouble should it get back to anyone at base. The guy chased him down outside and sucker punched him, so my grandpa knocked him out. When the guy fell, he hit the back of his neck on the curb and snapped his neck. My grandpa say this man lay motionless on the curbside as his own friends tried to shake him awake. Unfortunately, my papa and his buddies ran away before the cops arrived. He wrote this in a journal, admitting he should have turned himself in, and how much of a coward he was for not doing just that. Lived with the guilt all his life, until he died in 96. My great-grandfather got in a fight with his sister when he was 12. Said frick this. Asked for work on a boat as a cabin boy, got on a ship, and left England. He never went back. We have no idea if that side of the family even knows he survived, but I kind of want to go to the English town and tell my distantly extended family, so you know that little kid in your family history who just sort of disappeared, well, he lived. Surprise. Another great-grandfather stole a cannon from China, which my grandfather blew up accidentally with my dad nearby. Then left his future descendants a letter telling us, if you still have this last name and go to this part of China, don't mention your name. They might still be pretty mad off that I stole their cannon. A few generations back, a dude got kicked out of Norway for getting his maid and his sister pregnant. When he got to the US, he then befriended another guy from Scandinavia and stole his wife. It's funny because part of the family laughs about this, and part refuses to admit it ever happened, even though we have proof it did. My grandmother had 3 siblings and my grandfather had 6 siblings. They got married. Then my grandma's brother married my grandpa's sister. Then my grandma's first cousin married my grandpa's other sister. And then my grandma's second cousin married my grandma's third cousin. So there's no incest, but I have a whole lot of double or triple cousins. Not that unheard of, but my husband likes to tell people about when he first met my family. He went with me to visit one side, my mother's family, for Thanksgiving and met many of my uncles, aunts and cousins. The next day, we were going to have Thanksgiving on my other side, my father's family. When we walked in the door that next day, he stopped and his eyes got really wide and he loudly whispered, "Jke, these are the same people." And I went, "Yeah, I know." Surprise. My mother's brother married my father's sister and my mother's other sister married my father's first cousin. And then, if that isn't confusing enough, my grandmother and grandfather were first cousins when they got married. Legal as he was adopted as a teenager. My grandmother said she did this so she never had to change her last name, and she was the only girl short enough for him. My grandfather was only 5 ft 2 inches and my grandmother was 5 feet. Both came from Canada. Out of their 8 children, including 2 sons, the tallest is one of my aunts at 5 feet 4 inches. Luckily my mother, 5 feet, married my dad who was 6 ft 2 inch, so we at least had some height in our family. A relative declined an offer to invest with Henry Ford. He thought it was a fad. My grandma is a North Korean defector. I'm not fully North Korean, just a quarter. Oh, where to start? There's a book written about my great-great uncle who killed a man that wanted to marry his sister. Forget the name of the book. I'm a direct relation to John Hancock, which was my grandmother's maiden name. Not weird, just cool. My family was convinced for at least 3 generations that we were French and Cherokee. I bought that ancestry DNA kit for my parents, and it turns out we are Irish and English. My brother and I have a different blood type from either of our parents. Not a close difference. My mother is B and my dad is O. Both my brother and I are A. Apparently this is possible, but very rare and pretty much unheard of to happen twice from the same mother. They were convinced I was switched at birth because of it, and had to run both a paternity and maternity test. My mother has 6 brothers. Every single one of them, including her, had children in the order girl, boy, all of them. Now that our generation has started having kids, they've all, so far, been boy, girl. My great-grandparents moved from Buffalo, New York to St. Pete, FL and started a hamburger stand that became a small restaurant. One day, great-grandpa woke up my grandfather at 4 AM and said, "Get up. Do you want to be the cook today, or the waiter?" Gramps was confused and asked what he meant. "Your mother ran away with the cook last night. Do you want to wait her tables, or do the cooking?" The restaurant went on to local greatness, and Papa eventually found his mother 40 years later. The cook had been a poor choice, apparently, so she shacked up with the guy who did bullwhip tricks in a traveling circus. She had a starburst scar on her cheek, where he had missed flicking the cigarette from her lips during practice. Papa took care of her financially and visited her until she died. When my great-great-grandfather came to America, he took out an ad in the paper for a bride. My great-great-grandmother met him at the docks and they came across together, took advantage of the Homestead Act, and settled in Nebraska. My wife's family is the coolest freaking family ever. My wife is directly related to Marco Polo. Her family has deep roots in Italy and Sicily. Her mother's side of the family almost all have the last name Polo, including her own mother. They actually showed me the lineage pretty far back, with surprisingly few unknown areas in the family tree. Her great-grandfather was actually kicked out of his small town in southern Italy for being in the Italian Mafia. Yes, they raised money to send him to America from Italy in the early 20th century, to get rid of the patriarch of their mob. You think that's all the Mafia in her family? Hahaha. No, it gets worse. On her mother's side of the family there are also Cubans. Specifically, the Cuban cigar Mafia in Cuba and Florida. Her grandmother has grainy old pictures from her days as a Cuban cigar princess in parades and at town events in Ybor City and Tampa. My wife's crazy ass grandma took out one of those coffee table books on the Cuban Mafia, and there were freaking circled people in pictures with a bunch of machine guns and cash. And she pointed, like, there's your Uncle Diego and his wife Odalys. Oh, and there's Ernesto. He's such a sweetheart. When my wife's great-grandfather died, they put a block in the sidewalk in Ybor City that said name, our patriarch. They showed that to me too. I love this freaking family. Mom married the next door neighbor and moved to a different part of town. 40 years later my dad still lives next door to my stepfather's ex-wife. My grandfather was the first person in Guyana, South America, to have motorcycle, which he died and had one of the biggest funerals at that time. He was in the army. My father is a pathological liar who wouldn't let me be alone with my mother as a child because I would supposedly brainwash her. I just knew he was a liar at a young age and was honest with her. My grandmother is a psychopath. Her current husband has been living in fear for decades, and a few years ago a great aunt found a box full of audio tapes where he was trying to document what he thought were his final days. They came to be known as the Rasmussen tapes, his last name. He's a barely functioning alcoholic. I have no idea if he's still alive, but I grew up with the tapes being a running joke. My wife's family were closely related to a South American dictator in the 1950s. He got kicked out of power and many of them for political reasons came to the States. Many of them carry the entitlement without the resources. For example, one of them, living on SS with not a penny to their name, eschews canned soup and insists on only soup from restaurants at 5 times the price. Another is broke, but insists that her husband purchase only new cars because that is what she deserves. It's laughable. My great-great-grandfather was king of an Eastern European country for like a month. I don't think he ever actually set foot there, but at least he tried to learn the language a bit. My great-grandmother tried to tell Emperor Hirohito to stop the war in China, but she was instead sent to an asylum in Scotland where she was lobotomized. My uncle is a bigamist and both of his wives were called Susan. One of them was a circus strongwoman and master butcher. A different grandfather was a founding member of the awesome CIA and a famous ice jazz musician. A joke among my coworkers is that I'm the only member of my family without a Wikipedia page. My mom had a husband before my dad. Great guy, bought a house at 27. Had good money, all that. He died in a car crash when my mom was 23. Months later my mom was on her last 2 weeks on a job and a coworker said, there's a hot new detailer. I'm saving him for so and so. So my mom didn't take her crap, so she went and met my dad. That lady is a reason for my birth. She's good friends with my mom still. My mom lives 5 minutes from Paul McCartney's recording studio. She does her little daily walks past it every day. He's single, she's single, and she's still very much a catch at 63. I think you're talking to the future son-in-law of a Beatle here, folks. It's basically inevitable. My great-great-uncle was a former Missouri state treasurer who was impeached, but acquitted, for corruption. And the attorney who led the investigation was Rush Limbaugh's grandfather. I'm a 4th generation paratrooper. All the men on my father's side up to my great-grandfather have been to and graduated from the Army Basic Airborne School and have served in airborne units. Probably among the first groups of people to be 4th generation paratroopers. On my mom's side, my grandpa is a second cousin of Lee Harvey Oswald. On my dad's side, my great-great-great-grandfather was a member of a posse to catch Jesse James and Frank James at the Northfield attempted bank robbery. At some point in my family history, there was this crazy rich slave owner guy who also happened to be regular crazy. One thing he did was have a slave's arms and legs tied to a couple of horses and have them run in opposite directions. Which, ick now, not cool. My grandmother grew up in a portion of Korea that is currently part of the North. Her and her sisters began their escape when the North Koreans publicly executed their grandfather halfway through the Korean War because he was the spiritual leader of their small town. When escaping, their group stopped along the way when some heavy fighting in the area broke out just north of the now DMZ. Her group hid in a wine cellar for over a week while troops marched above them. Eventually the fighting stopped and Koreans knocked on the cellar door saying the war was over and that it was safe to come out. One by one, every person was beheaded as they left. Only my grandmother survived, as she was young and told to wait for everyone else to say it was safe. For whatever stroke of God's luck, they didn't find her, but she left the cellar. Climbing through the pile of beheaded bodies of her friends and family piled around the cellar doors. Eventually she got to the southern border and married my grandfather, an American soldier. All of my grandparents have similar stories with where they're from, and by all rights, they should all have been dead by 30. The fact I exist is a miracle. Not my story, but my wife recently did one of those ancestry DNA tests and found out that she is 24.2% Greek, rest 75.8% pure Finnish. As expected, her grandmother always told her about a Greek guy that she dated before she met her grandfather. Guess that explains her father's darker skin tone and black hair. We haven't told about this to anyone in the family. Her grandmother is 85 years old and we don't wanna cause any trouble for the sweet old woman. I come from a history of criminals and crazy people. My bio grandpa on my dad's side was busted smuggling an RV full of marijuana across state lines. Not that I wouldn't do that myself. My grandma on my mom's side smothered her own mom to death with a pillow, changed her will, and took all the money. No one knows about this, but my mom and I, and there were never any legal repercussions. My grandparents on my mom's side bought and ran an entire mortuary for the sole purpose of stealing social security from dead people. Grandma on mom's side spent a lot of my mom's childhood trying to figure out how to kill my grandpa. She asked my mom for help brainstorming ideas when my mom was a child. My mom is disabled and on her 10th major spinal surgery. My dad is a raging alcoholic. My grandma on my dad's side is an abusive narcissist. The list really goes on and on. There are so very many more that I don't have time to type out at the moment. I'm a really happy person though. I enjoy life and try not to let all the bad blood, literally, in my family get me down. I have my moments of depression, but I think we all do. That I'm able to look up nearly every family member till about 1300 thanks to my uncle and his hobby. My surname is Butt, yeah. My father passed away 2 years ago. I found out he was a Mossad agent for 45 years. Then I found out that my mom was one too. They both knew they worked for the government, but they never told each other what they did exactly. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can watch together.